very warm welcome to the new episode of Ink and Insights. I'm extremely pleased today to welcome one of the most talented personality in Mysore. She wears multiple hats. She is a career diplomat. She is an award-winning author. She writes. She sings sometimes. She paints, and she does multiple of things. I'm extremely pleased to welcome Australian Ambassador to Nepal, Felicity Volk, in my program. Ambassador, thank you so much for your time. It's such a pleasure to have you in Mysore.
Thanks so much, Samir. I'm really delighted to be here and very honoured to be on your program. Thank you.
So I missed out one important aspect of yours in my introduction, which I'd like to include now. She has also acted in a Bollywood movie way back, if I'm not wrong.
Correct.
So that reminds me, I recently completed one book by Dipti Naval, a Bollywood actor. She has written a book on a country called Childhood, which is titled a memoir. So I want to take you back to your country, to your childhood, and want to hear from you. What was it like? Which part of Australia were you grown up? How was it when you were growing up?
Thanks. It's always nice to be taken back to childhood when you've had a fairly happy childhood, which mine certainly was. So I grew up in Victoria, in Melbourne, for the first 10 years of my life. I had an older brother. I see that first period of my life as being quite instructive for everything that came afterwards. When I was about 7 years old, my parents, who were both English teachers, both educators, they took our family on a year's sabbatical, and we were in a Bedford van travelling through Europe. So in what was then the USSR, we were in very unusual places, had unusual experiences, but it was my first childhood exposure to what it was like to live in other countries and to travel and to see the world, even at that young age, through other people's eyes. And I think that set me on a journey which has resulted in me joining DFAT, wanting to work overseas, DFAT being our foreign service, but also in my writing, wanting to draw in other parts of the world into what I write. So not just writing about Australia, Australian context, but bringing in universal themes and universal characters.
In your work. So, you opted, I guess you chose English literature and then law in your undergrad. So your inclination towards literature started long back, or it was after your studies completed you started writing?
I would say my inclination to literature started from pretty much the day I was born. And again, it was the influence of my parents. Some of my earliest memories are of my parents reading to my brother and myself every night. After we finished dinner, we would have whatever the book of the day was, it would be read to us, and then books at bedtime as well. So, books by Tolkien, by Kenneth Grahame, some of the classics were very much a feature of my childhood. And so I had instilled in me an absolute love of literature. And then both my parents were also writing. They were dabblers.
Oh, they were writing as well?
Mostly poetry. And when they were working full-time throughout their professional careers, they didn't have a lot of time to write. I think we all experienced that problem. But they did write a bit of poetry. My mother, who's now in her 80s, is a prolific writer. She's published a number of novels.
She's still writing?
She's still writing. She's launching another book this year in a few months' time. And she's in her mid-80s, so very active. But my father also wrote poetry. And he wrote me a very beautiful poem when I was in my early teens. And it was the first time anyone had written a poem for me. And it left this indelible sense of how when there are things that are precious in your life, the way to hold them permanently is to capture them in words. And the importance of using words and creative language to hold that which is precious to us. So I had that early modelling from my parents.
Right. So, were you also participant in your university in the literature platform or in societies? those days?
Well, so when
did you start writing, by the way?
I started writing probably when I was about 5 or 6.
Oh, okay.
I was writing. I was also writing poetry and short stories throughout my
Right.
childhood. I had a few pieces published in school magazines, in the local newspaper. I used to enter poems into competitions and so on. So I had a sense of wanting to produce work that then communicated something to people beyond my family.
Right.
I was interested clearly in publishing from a young age.
Okay.
Then at university, when I was studying English literature, again, I was writing short stories and publishing a little bit, but in fairly informal venues.
Yeah.
And then I was writing pretty much throughout my entire life, except at the moment, life is way too busy. So
I can
occasionally a
imagine that.
poem here or there, but that's about it.
Yeah. But it's very interesting, Ambassador Felicity, you know, the childhood upbringing in different society, more or less, remains the same. I mean, I remember my parents talking about the stories from Hindu religion scripts, you know, narrating to us while we were dining with them together before we go to bed. And you had a similar experience as well from your parents. So it
doesn't matter where you are in the world. I think those same impulses towards storytelling are in all of us. And it's interesting that you mention your parents telling you stories from scripture, because for me, it wasn't just literature that was read to us. I also grew up in a Christian family, and so biblical story was very much part of my diet at a young age. And regardless of where you end up in your faith journey, I think that these stories, these archetypal stories, are so important, because I think we find those themes weaving through whatever we write ourselves. You know, they're stories that we all relate to. And that appeal universally. And so, you know, those themes are so important: good versus evil, relationship, truth, honesty, all of these things, which I think are part of our childhood upbringing. Then we carry them on into whatever we produce as adults.
So this Lightning, the copy of, I have a copy of yours book with me. This is an award-winning debut novel that you penned down. And, you know, you have characters from Persia, from Pakistan, and who goes to Australia. And could you please shed some light on the plot of this?
So the Lightning actually covers only 10 days in the lives of my two protagonists. One is a 4th, 5th generation Australian whose her name is Persia, and her forebears have come from German Lutheran missionaries who came to Australia in the 1800s, and Afghan Cameleers who also came around that time to Australia. And so she traces her heritage back to migrants to Australia. The story begins with her going into labour. She's a single woman, pregnant, and she's decided to have her baby at home, and for reasons due to a catastrophe at that time, no one can come to assist her with the birth, and the child is stillborn. And she decides to carry the body of the baby with her through to Central Australia, from where her forebears came, in a suitcase. And there's a whole series of misadventures. And en route she meets a Pakistani who has pretended to be an Afghan to gain asylum in Australia. And he also knows that his case is under review. It's in the early 2000s, and at a time when government policy was not that embracing of some of our migrants and refugees. And so he's disappearing into Central Australia. And so Ahmed and Persia travel together, and they tell each other their stories of grief and loss en route as they travel into the desert. And the desert, as it is in many religious scriptures, is a place of both severe deprivation but also learning. It's a place of testing, and it's a place of transcendence. And so in their lives, this time in the desert together ends up being a time of healing for them over the course of just a 10-day period.
So what comes to your mind when you think of theme or the plot of the novel? I mean, what motivates you to come up with the themes?
So I tend not to think of the themes beforehand and then overlay those over character.
Right.
I usually more have a sense of character and a little bit about their personal journey, and then theme evolves from that. It's not a conscious decision for me that I'm going to write about national identity or the environment or anything in particular, but I usually have a sense of character.
Right.
And I have a sense of their circumstance.
Right.
And for me, every story starts with the question, why? And I think all of our life stories start with that question, why?
True.
You know, whether it's those really big questions like, why am I here?
Yeah.
Why is this happening to me?
Philosophical questions.
Yeah. And it's the same, I think, when we tell story. My starting point is, so I knew I had this conception that there was a character, a very solitary character, Persia, who had come from multiple different cultural and historic influences. And my question in myself was, why is she such a loner? Why is she someone who is labouring alone? Why is she disappearing by herself with this baby into the desert? And then for Ahmed, it was, why has he come to Australia? Why did he make the decisions in Pakistan that made it impossible for him to stay there? And so it's answering those questions. Why were they this way? Why did these things happen to them? That the rest of the story unfolds. And what I discovered about my characters is that not only were they having that experience of, in Ahmed's case, being a stranger in a strange land, but in Persia's case, she was a stranger in her own life. And so that exploration of sense of self and identity, isolation, connection, all of these themes started to emerge from that exploration of character.
So, and in that case, how do you develop characters as such? I mean, do you have this anticipation or thinking that you spot on some characters and you develop that, or you creatively delve into that and think about those characters and sort of help them come out?
A little bit of both. My characters are not fully formed and I don't know everything about them when I start writing. And for me, one of the beauties of the writing process is that magical thing that happens where you feel like you're not actually necessarily in control of the story or the narrative or the character, that at some point the story and the character takes on a life of their own and they take over the storytelling. And I know it can sound a little bit precious, but I actually feel that there is a point where the writer lets go of the reins and says, okay, you're not on your own, but I know you're leading the journey now. And sometimes it's a product of just sitting for a long time with the characters as you're writing and asking those questions why and posing those questions to the characters. Sometimes it's the research that you do en route, because I tend to research a lot as I'm going, and the research will lead me down a rabbit hole, and that then tells me something new that I think ascribes to the character or to the story, and then that takes me on another path that I have not planned at all. And so there's this conversation that occurs between character and narrative and writer. And sometimes mine is the dominant voice and sometimes theirs is the dominant voice.
It's a fine equilibrium that needs to be, I guess, But I personally tend to, sometimes be influenced by the context, the global or the national context, the prevailing narratives, the prevailing time, the kind of disruptions that we go through at that particular time of in the historical juncture of that particular time. Do you feel that way as well?
I think I try to avoid it a bit because my concern with being too influenced by, prevailing circumstance or politics or external events is that you can end up becoming a bit didactic in the writing. That's what I fear about myself, that if, you look at the terrible catastrophe of environmental degradation and climate change, and if that is a prevailing preoccupation, there's the danger that you become didactic in your writing. I think it's important to set context. And so whenever you're
Yeah.
whatever period you're writing in,
Yeah.
to be conscious of what the prevailing circumstances were,
Right.
whether it was war or climate or, social attitudes, whatever.
Yeah.
I think it's important to be authentic to the time. And if you're writing a contemporary piece,
True.
be authentic to contemporary times.
Yeah.
But be careful. For me, I tell myself, be careful not to get too caught up in external events. I'm more interested in writing those universal themes, or seeing the way those universal themes play out in the narrative, and how external circumstance then feeds into that, rather than the other way around.
Yeah. And I also have a copy of your second fiction, Desire Lines. And I read this book, a wonderful love story. Could you please tell something about this work as well to my audience?
So Desire Lines is a story that's set over 60 years. And again, I've worked with two characters. One is Paddy, who has come from a very dysfunctional childhood, growing up in London in a situation where his father is an abusive, drunk philanderer, Irish Catholic. And Paddy, at a very early age, is sent as a child migrant to Australia.
Right.
There was a scheme called the Fairbridge Farm School Scheme, and students, young people from around the Commonwealth countries, would be sent to different places, and they would learn and they would be educated at farm schools, and they would work at farm schools, and this was regarded as a healthy way of life, in Australia for people from underprivileged backgrounds. So Paddy comes out to Australia at the age of about 7. And he is experiencing institutional abuse. He skirts around the edges of abuse in this farm school, has a very troubled childhood. He crosses paths with Evie, who is my female protagonist. They cross paths at the age of 16. Evie's come from a relatively idyllic childhood in a middle-class family in Canberra. They have a brief but very passionate sort of teenage love. And then they separate, they lose contact, but they come together again when they're in their late 20s, when they both have young children. And they come together when Evie is a landscape architect, Paddy is an architect, and they're working on the construction of the High Court of Australia. And they reconnect, they are still in love, and then they, because of their other families, have again a very difficult, tortuous sort of love story. So Paddy is a character who is driven by the need to keep things secret, to hide his past, to lie as a way of protecting himself. Evie is driven by the need to be honest and authentic. And so these different approaches butt heads the whole way through the novel. But it sets that theme of the lies we tell ourselves to survive, and that calling to be authentic and honest. It sets that also against the national stage. And the way Australia, in its history, and particularly in relation to its Indigenous community, in relation to institutional abuse of children, the way Australia has navigated truth and lies in its on the national stage. So again, looking at those themes at the personal and universal level, but picking up on the backdrop of what happens at the national level.
Right. So do you think that the Australian context, since writing of this work, has changed, or you think it has gone through different phases and stages right now? And where do you see the Australian society at that now?
So I think Australia, like every country, is on a perpetual journey of learning about how to be a cohesive, compassionate, sophisticated society, sort of ethically sophisticated society. And we've had we continue to have issues in terms of the treatment of our Indigenous, our First Nations people.
Right.
We continue to be finding a way to navigate both the opportunities and challenges of an intensely migration-focused community.
Right.
We have people from around 200 countries, part of
Absolutely.
Australia. We have 130,000 Nepalis who've made
Absolutely.
Australia their home,
Yeah.
60,000 Nepali students.
Right.
And that's just one population.
I know.
So, how do you have people from so many different traditions, so many different cultures, religions, live in harmony, in
Right.
community?
True.
And that does present challenges.
Right.
I think our biggest challenge these days is still giving due respect to and inclusion of our Indigenous community. And we've just recently had a referendum on a voice to Parliament for our Indigenous community a few months ago.
Right.
And the majority of people, including a lot of people in the Indigenous community, voted down that referendum.
Okay.
So it did not proceed.
Right.
And that to me tells me that a lot of the themes around relations with Indigenous people that are part of Desire Lines, this is not the end of the story yet.
Right.
There are more chapters to go.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So, there are always the visualization of society which sort of dominates the thinking of a writer. As an Australian writer yourself, how do you see, the kind of society that Australia is becoming, in a process of becoming? How do you see that particular society would accommodate those diverse thing in a down the line, and what could be the theme for the Australian writer in the future?
So I think we've actually become very good at embracing diversity.
Right.
I can see a huge difference in Australian society today from where it was back when I was growing up. When I was growing up, it was migration was very European focused, and then in
Absolutely.
the 70s it was more Southeast Asia, so Vietnamese refugees following the Vietnam War. And then we've shifted more. We've had a huge influx of people from South Asia.
Right.
We've had more people coming from African countries. But then also a lot from the Pacific.
Right.
And so we do have this incredible melting pot of culture and practice and history. And I think what I can see is that society in Australia has become far more embracing and tolerant of this range of differences among its population. And I think that spells a very positive future for us. I think we're moving in a great direction. So what it means for writers is that we now have some incredibly talented writers who grew up, for example, in Sri Lanka.
Right.
We have a huge shift towards wanting to hear stories from our Indigenous people. So there are very celebrated Indigenous writers who are taking out all of the awards, literary awards in Australia. There is a great appreciation of story that shifts from beyond where it used to be, which was a very anglicised or very European, Caucasian storytelling tradition in Australia.
Right.
And it's become far more now focused on story from Southeast Asia, from South Asia, from Africa. Yeah, as well as I said, a great celebration of our Indigenous storytelling.
Right. So I also ask this because this is not, confined to the Australian society alone, Felicity, because, we are living in a time, where everything looks so disrupted. And it's the other day, this week, I was talking with one of the globally renowned philosopher, and he was telling me wherein every sciences seems to be blurring the differences. Take either you talk about physics, now it's started talking about consciousness. It was a part of spirituality and religion at some point of time. And people are talking about literature. I mean, so much of disruptions in our life because of new technologies, new innovations. So what does it mean to be a writer in such a context?
It's probably a question you'd need to pose to writers of different ages, I think. For me, I think what it makes me do, because I think the external world is it's so rapidly changing. It's also very confusing for most people.
True.
I think things that we've held fast to, traditional values, traditional ways of doing things, completely upended, as you've said. And I think the way I personally respond to that is a need for simplicity, a need for coming back to basics, because otherwise I think I wouldn't be able to write anything. And I say this knowing that I have not written anything for the duration of the last 4 years, and I think a lot of the change we've seen has been particularly rapid in the last 4 years.
Right.
So I'm projecting into the future when I get back into writing at the end of my time here in Nepal. Right. But I think what I'll be going back to is more a harking back to the past,
right,
because I take reassurance out of the past.
Right.
So I think what writers do is they create worlds that are both dangerous but also comfortable at the same time. For me, I need a basic level of comfort and understanding of the world I inhabit.
Right.
And the world that I see outside these four walls is not a very comfortable or easy world to inhabit. So my tendency in what I write will be to go back to a world that is comfortable from the point of view of my understanding of it. So I'll probably be writing more in the past than into the future.
Right.
Yep.
Right. And do you have, when you used to write these two fictions or your short stories collection, do you have any writing rituals that you follow?
I do. I'm not the person who gets up at 4 a.m. to write. My brain does not function until about, 8 a.m.
Right.
So my ritual with writing design lines, I was in the luxurious position of having 2 grants, which enabled me to take a year off my paid work.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
and to sit at home and just write without interruption. My daughters at that stage were in secondary school. My ritual then was I would drop them at the bus stop at about 8:30. I would be home by 9 o'clock. I would make a huge pot of green tea.
Okay.
I had a special teapot. It was an antique Sheffield silver teapot.
Right.
And it sat beside me, and I would sit at the dining table with the sun on my back.
Right.
And my rule to myself was I was not allowed to get up until I'd written at least 1,000 words, which is not a lot, but they were very carefully crafted words. And so
it takes time.
It does take time.
Yeah.
So I would write usually for about 5 or 6 hours, and then I would stop and then go and pick up the kids and then make dinner and start again the next day. And every day was exactly the same.
Wow. Yeah. So I was also wondering, you wear so many hats. You are a career diplomat. You are an award-winning author. You do paint sometimes. You do sing sometimes. Where do you get energy to do all these things at the same time?
I'm basically an introvert, so which is hard in my profession, because I'm dealing a lot with people all the time. So where I get my energy from is finding quiet spaces and carving out time just for myself.
Sure.
So at the moment, I'm on a regime where I'm lucky if I get half a day to myself at all, and that's over the weekend. But I'm quite now religious about making sure that nothing encroaches on that. But energy, we find our energy from the things we love. And I love creative life, whether that is writing or if it's singing or painting. That is what gives me energy, the joy of bringing something into being, and that that only you can do. Because the reality is, a whole lot of people could be Australia's ambassador to Nepal. A whole lot of people could be working as you do, at the British Embassy. A whole lot of people could be working as camera people or sound people on productions. But it's the unique thing that we bring into the world that I think is what gives us meaning. And whether that is through your professional work done uniquely, or whether it's through an act of creation like a novel or a poem or a painting, or joining a group of people to sing something that is beautiful, that offers something beautiful to the world.
Absolutely.
I think these are the places where we get our meaning, and that give us then energy.
it's in a way also a process, perhaps, of finding yourself. In the when you are engaged in the whole process. So before I end up, perhaps my last question to you would be, when are you coming up with your next novel?
Well, a few different options here.
Right.
I actually, when I'd finished the publication draft of
Right.
Desire Lines, so once I was heading into the editing production stage, I still had 3 months left of the year I took off work, and I started to write another novel then. I think it's a young adult novel. I've written around 12,000 words. I haven't touched it now for 4 years. That's first cab off the rank. But while I've been here in Nepal, I have been just gathering little seeds of ideas.
Right.
And one of the things that has really struck me about Nepal is that way magic and mysticism and myth weave together.
Absolutely.
And I would like to write a novel set here that somehow draws out that quality of Nepal. In Lightning, it steers towards magical realism at times, that blend of reality and hyper-reality. And I think Nepal is, as a backdrop for that sort of writing, it's a perfect blend, because there is so much magic and mysticism that occurs here. The only person who I've seen do that really well recently is Smriti Ravinder, with her book The Woman Who Climbed Trees, which I'm reading at the moment, and loving that sense of she lives at that edge of reality and hyper-reality. And so I'd like to write something in that genre set here. But I've got ideas for about 4 novels I'd like to write. Some set in Australia, one here.
So I wish you all the best for that.
Thank you.
And Ambassador Felicity, thank you so much. It's just been my honor to have you in my show. Thank you so much for your time once again.
Thank you for your time. Great to be here. Thanks.